There is a scorecard somewhere in California that says 900, and for more than 40 years, the men who run the sport of bowling refused to let that number mean what it plainly means. 300, 300, 300. 36 strikes without a single pin left standing, thrown one after another on a summer night in a suburban bowling alley by a 52-year-old man who was, at the time, managing a liquor store to keep the lights on. No human being had ever done it before in sanctioned play. Plenty have done it since, and their names sit in the record books with a little gold star beside them. His does not. And if you want to understand who Glenn Allison was, you have to start there, in the gap between what a man accomplished and what the world agreed to call it, because he lived the rest of his long life inside that gap, and he did it without turning bitter, which is a harder trick than any of the strikes.
He was born on the 22nd of May, 1930, in Whittier, California, a citrus town on the eastern edge of Los Angeles County, where the orange groves still ran right up against the new subdivisions. His father, Leo, sold cars, which, in the Depression, was a job that required a man to be charming even when nobody had money, and maybe Glenn learned something there about how to keep smiling when the deal falls through. His mother was Stella Blackford. The family was not wealthy, not by any measure that mattered, and the boy grew up in the kind of Southern California that has largely vanished now, a place of open land and cheap gasoline and a certain unhurried optimism that the whole country seemed to share for a while after the war. He was not a big man. He would top out at 5'7", a compact, quick-handed kid, and in a sport that did not yet exist as a profession, he found the thing he was going to be better at than almost anyone alive.
You have to remember what bowling was in America then, because it was not the thing it later became. It was not a novelty or a birthday party diversion. It was a working man's religion, a Saturday night sacrament conducted in low buildings that smelled of cigarette smoke and floor wax and spilled beer under banks of fluorescent light to the endless percussion of falling pins. In the years before and after the war, the bowling alley was one of the few places where a man who spent his days on an assembly line or behind a delivery wheel could become, for 2 hours a week, something more than his paycheck. He could be a star in his league, a name people knew, a man whose average was quoted with respect at the corner tavern. Whole neighborhoods organized their weeks around league night. Factories sponsored teams. Taverns sponsored teams. The lanes were democratic in a way that few American institutions were. Open to the immigrant and the native-born, the Catholic and the Protestant, anyone who could put a curve on a 16-pound ball and keep his nerve in the 10th frame. Into this world, a small, quick boy from Whittier fit like a hand into a worn glove, and the world, for a while, would love him back. He learned the game the way boys learned it then, by hanging around the local house until the men let him roll, by watching and imitating and failing and watching again. By developing in his hands and his hips and his eyes a kind of knowledge that cannot be taught from a book, the feel of the ball's weight and the read of the oil and the precise geometry of the pocket where the ball must enter to send all 10 pins flying. He did not have the height or the raw power of some of the giants of the game.
What he had instead was accuracy and consistency, and an almost preternatural calm. The ability to repeat the same beautiful motion 100 times, 1,000 times, and to keep repeating it when everything was on the line and the room had gone quiet. These are the gifts that last. Power fades with age. Precision, cared for, can survive into a man's 10th decade, and in Allison's case, it very nearly did. Picture it. A boy of 16 in 1947, riding into downtown Los Angeles because the great traveling tournament, the American Bowling Congress Championships, had come to town that year. He entered. He was a child among grown men, most of them factory workers and tavern regulars who had been rolling balls down wooden lanes since before he was born, and he did not embarrass himself.
That was the beginning of something nobody could have predicted, least of all the boy himself. Because from that year forward, Glenn Allison would return to that tournament again and again, decade after decade, until the number of his appearances became a record that may never be broken. 72 times he made that long walk down the center aisle to the roar of a crowd, and the last time he did it, he was 93 years old. But that is getting ahead of the story, and Glenn Allison never rushed anything. In the early 50s, still a young man, he did what a lot of ambitious Californians did in reverse. He left the sunshine and went east, to Chicago first, drawn by the money and the competition. Because in those years, the real bowling, the serious money bowling, happened in the industrial Midwest. Milwaukee, Chicago, Detroit, St. Louis. These were the capitals of the sport, cities where beer companies sponsored teams the way corporations now sponsor stadiums, where a great bowler could be a genuine local celebrity, his face on the sports page beside the ball players. He caught on with the Pabst team in Chicago, and then he moved to St. Louis and joined the Falstaff team, the Falstaffs, sponsored by the beer of the same name. And this is where the legend of Glenn Allison as a bowler truly took shape, because those Falstaff teams were something close to a dream team of their era. He bowled alongside men whose names still echo in the sport, Harry Smith and Billy Welu among them, and together they were nearly unbeatable. Team bowling in those days was the marquee event, a 5-man unit rolling in perfect rotation, each man carrying his share, and Allison was as reliable as any of them.
He was an All-American in 1957 and 1958, and again in 1961 and 1962, which, in the language of that world, meant he was among the very best in the country. When you bowled with Falstaff, you were not just an athlete, you were part of a traveling show, and the friendships forged on those long drives between tournaments and in those smoky alleys lasted the rest of these men's lives. Years later, deep into old age, Allison would still speak of being fortunate to have been on one of the better teams, to have witnessed and been part of special moments, and there was no false modesty in it. He knew what he had been given. There is something about team bowling in that vanished era that is difficult to convey to anyone who did not live inside it. A great team was not 5 individuals standing next to one another. It was a single organism. 5 men who trusted one another absolutely, who knew each other's tendencies and rhythms and weaknesses the way brothers know them, who could feel when one man was struggling and carry him, who could feel when the whole unit was locked in and ride the wave together. They spent enormous stretches of their lives in one another's company, crossing the country by car and by those slow propeller-driven airliners, sitting up late in motel rooms and roadside diners, talking the endless shop talk of men obsessed with a craft. They were, in the truest sense, a band of brothers, and the bonds ran deep. When Allison spoke, decades later, of his teammates and his years with Falstaff, there was a tenderness in it that had nothing to do with trophies. Billy Welu, who bowled beside him, went on to become the beloved television voice of the sport before dying suddenly and far too young. And men like Allison carried the memory of those departed teammates the way old soldiers carry the memory of the men they served with. The Lanes gave Glenn Allison his greatest friendships as surely as they gave him his greatest triumphs and his deepest wound. And the friendships, one suspects, meant more to him in the end than any of it. It was a golden time, and he knew it even as he lived it, which is rare because most people only recognize their golden times in the rearview mirror. He was young and gifted and surrounded by men he loved, doing the thing he was born to do, in a country that had emerged from war into a long, bright afternoon of prosperity and possibility. And the bowling alleys were full, and the crowds were loud, and the money, for a man at the top of the game, was real. He carried that time with him always. When he was an old man being honored at yet another tournament, he would reach back to those years, to the very first cross-country flight that had brought a young Californian east to compete, and his voice would soften. Those were the days that made him. The titles came. 4 championships at the great national tournament spread across a decade, and each one a different flavor of triumph. In 1962, he won the classic doubles alongside Dick Hoover, 2 men in rhythm. In 1964, his Falstaff team took the classic team crown, the whole unit clicking at once. In 1966, he won team again with a different sponsor, the Ace Mitchell Sure Hooks, proving it was no fluke of any particular lineup. And in 1970, alone this time, just himself against the field, he won the classic singles, the purest test there is. 1 man and the pins, and nobody to blame or credit but himself. 10 more times he finished in the top 10 at that tournament. The man simply did not miss the big stage. And in 1958, when a handful of the sport's best players got together and decided that professional bowling ought to be a real profession with a real tour, Glenn Allison was there.
He was a charter member of the Professional Bowlers Association, one of the founding fathers of the modern game, present at the creation. He went on to win 5 titles on that new PBA tour, most of them clustered in the early 60s when he was in his prime. The Memphis Open in 1962, the Salt Lake Open the same year, a tournament in Oklahoma in 1963, 2 more in 1964 out in Arizona and back home in California. Brunswick sponsored him, put him on their advisory staff, and for a stretch there, he was one of the recognizable faces of a sport that was, in that television age, genuinely popular. Bowling was on network TV on Saturday afternoons, and men across America who worked in factories and drove trucks and sold insurance sat in their living rooms and watched these matches with the attention now reserved for football. Allison knew those announcers, Chris Schenkel and his old teammate Billy Welu, and sometimes he would feed them statistics and observations during the broadcasts, a player helping tell the story of his own sport. Those were the years when a man could become famous rolling a ball down a wooden lane, and it is worth pausing on how strange and wonderful that was. Every Saturday, network television carried professional bowling into millions of American living rooms, and the sports stars became household names in a way that seems almost unimaginable now. Fathers and sons sat together and watched. Men argued about the bowlers the way they argued about ball players.
And Allison was part of that world, a recognizable figure in it, close to the announcers who narrated the drama to the nation. He knew Chris Schenkel, the smooth and courtly voice of so many broadcasts, and he knew Billy Welu behind the microphone, his old teammate turned commentator. And there were times when Allison would lean in and offer the announcers a statistic or an observation, a competitor helping to tell the story of his own sport to the country. He was, for a stretch of years in the American century, a small but genuine star, and the men watching at home in the industrial cities and the farm towns felt that they knew him. He could have been a lifer on the tour, chasing checks around the country until his arm gave out. He chose something different. By the 1970s, he had cut back his tour schedule and put down roots in the business end of the sport, becoming the proprietor of his own bowling center, Glenn Allison Lanes, out near the Los Angeles airport.
It was a natural move for a man who loved the game and understood it from the ground up, who knew lanes and pins and the machinery of the place as intimately as he knew the release of a ball from his own hand. There is a certain dream in it, the champion who becomes the owner, who turns his fame and his knowledge into a home base, a place with his own name over the door, where the sport that made him could go on making him a living. But bowling centers are hard businesses, thin-margined and demanding, dependent on leagues and open play, and the endless small economics of shoe rentals and beer sales, and the constant expensive upkeep of the machinery. And the venture did not make him rich. The economics of the sport were already beginning their long, slow shift, the crowds thinning as the decades turned, the television money drying up, the culture moving on to other diversions. Somewhere in there, the alley passed out of his hands. The dream did not hold.
By the summer of 1982, the summer that would define the rest of his life, Glenn Allison, 4-time national champion, PBA founding member, one of the founding fathers of professional bowling in America, was managing a liquor store on Leffingwell Avenue back in Whittier, the town where he was born. The circle had closed in the least glamorous way imaginable. The boy who had left Whittier to conquer the bowling capitals of the Midwest had come home to Whittier to sell whiskey and cigarettes to strangers past 50, his championship years behind him, the crowds and the cameras a memory. Think about that for a moment. Think about what it means to have stood on the highest platforms your sport can offer, to have been one of the best in the world at the thing you love, and then to find yourself, past 50, ringing up bottles behind a counter to pay the bills.
There is a particular loneliness in that, a quiet that settles over a man when the applause has faded and the ordinary years stretch out ahead. He never made a great public drama of it, but it was there, the ordinary struggle of a working man who had once been a star. And it makes what happened next almost unbearably poignant. The 1st of July, 1982, La Habra 300 Bowl in the town of La Habra just east of Whittier, close to home. It was a Thursday night, a mixed league called the Anchor Girl Trio League, the kind of low-stakes evening league that fills bowling centers across America. Neighbors and co-workers and couples rolling for fun and a little pride. Lanes 13 and 14. Glenn Allison, 52 years old, rolled a strike. Then another. Then another. He rolled a perfect game, 300, and there is nothing unheard of in that. He had done it before, 5 times on the professional tour alone, but he did not stop.
Second game, 12 more strikes, another perfect 300. And now the room began to change. Word travels through a bowling alley like current through water, and people drifted over from other lanes, and the easy Thursday night chatter died down because everyone understood that they were watching a man reach for something that had never been done. The third game, frame after frame, strike after strike, the ball finding the pocket every single time, the pins scattering clean. The silence in that room by the 10th frame must have been its own kind of pressure. Hundreds of eyes on a 52-year-old liquor store manager, and he did not flinch. He threw the last 3 balls of the 10th frame, the way the game requires, filling out the final frame, and every one of them struck. 36 strikes in a row. 900. The room erupted. For a night in that suburban alley, Glenn Allison had touched perfection 3 times over, done the thing that the greatest bowlers who ever lived had never managed in official play. He was, in that moment, immortal. The trouble came the next morning. Because a 900 series is not simply celebrated in the sport of bowling, it is investigated, and the machinery of officialdom turned toward La Habra with a speed that in retrospect feels almost predatory. The very next day, officials from the American Bowling Congress, along with the local and regional bowling authorities, arrived at the center to inspect the lanes. Their concern was the oil, the dressing applied to the lane surface, the invisible film that governs how a ball hooks and slides.
There were rules, precise and technical rules, about how lanes had to be conditioned for a score to count. Rules written by delegates at annual conventions, and after their inspection, the officials concluded that the lanes at La Habra had not been dressed in accordance with those rules. And so they denied it. They refused to sanction the greatest league series in the history of the sport. On paper, in the eyes of the governing body, Glenn Allison's 900 had never happened. It is worth understanding what a strange and cruel thing this was, and worth understanding it fairly, because the officials were not villains twirling mustaches. The rules existed. They believed the lane condition did not comply. There was even a lawsuit that followed, litigated in federal court in California, and the court upheld the officials' determination. By the letter of the law of 1982, the decision stood, and yet consider the ball he used, a Columbia yellow dot, a piece of equipment from an era before the high-friction, computer-designed bowling balls that would later make perfect scores far more common. Consider that La Habra that night was known as a difficult, low-scoring house, not some doctored track laid out to inflate scores. Consider that in the decades since, more than 24 900 series have been approved and sanctioned, many of them rolled with modern equipment under conditions no more pure than his, and that the ABC and its successor eventually did away with the very post-score lane inspections that had doomed him in the first place. He was, as one supporter put it with plain fury, robbed. His nose rubbed in it, over and over, for the rest of his life. There was a second wound layered inside the first. Because he was, at 52 years and 40 days old, also the oldest man ever to roll a 900, and when a younger bowler decades later was celebrated by the governing body as the oldest to achieve the feat, that too was a record quietly denied to Allison, another line in the book where his name should have been and was not. Shafted again, his defenders said. And you can hear in that phrase the accumulated frustration of a community that felt one of its own had been wronged and could not make it right. And you have to sit with what that denial actually did to a man's daily life, because it was not a single blow that landed once and faded. It was a wound that kept reopening.
Every time a younger bowler rolled a 900 and had it cheerfully sanctioned, every time the sport celebrated a new perfect series with a plaque and a press release, the phone would ring, or a reporter would find him, or someone at the alley would bring it up, and there it was again. The old question, the old ache. Why not yours, Glenn? Why did theirs count and yours did not? He was made to relive the disappointment on a schedule not of his choosing. For more than 40 years, a man forced again and again to explain and to relitigate the greatest moment of his athletic life, to defend a triumph that should have needed no defense. Most of us are permitted to bury our disappointments and move on. Allison was not. His was public, permanent, and endlessly renewed, and he had to find a way to live beside it every single day. Here is where a lesser man breaks. Here is where bitterness curdles into a life.
And Glenn Allison, to the lasting astonishment of everyone who knew him, did not break. He carried the disappointment. Of course he did. No man could shrug off something like that. And over the years, there were reevaluations and petitions and campaigns by historians and fans to have his series retroactively certified. And each time the answer came back the same. And each time it must have reopened the old cut. As late as 2014, the United States Bowling Congress, the ABC's successor, formally reviewed the case one more time and once more upheld the denial, reasoning in part that reversing it would call into question thousands of other historical scores from that murky era. Even then, 32 years on, the door stayed shut. But somewhere in all of it, Allison made a choice about how to hold the thing, and the choice was grace. He kept bowling. He kept showing up. He let the world call him Mr. 900, whether the world sanctioned it or not, because the people who loved the sport knew what they had seen, and their memory was a kind of certification no committee could grant or take away. And through all of it, the tournament remained. Year after year, he made his pilgrimage to the national championships, that same event he had first entered as a boy of 16. He missed a couple in his youth, but from 1954 onward, he never skipped a single edition, an unbroken chain of loyalty to the game that had both crowned and cheated him. In 2006, he crossed 100,000 career pins at the tournament, one of a tiny handful of men ever to do it. In 2011, he made his 60th appearance, marching down that center aisle to a standing ovation. And there beside him, proud, was his wife Marcia, who had been at his side since 1995.
The applause of nearly 300 fellow bowlers washed over an 80-year-old man who had given his whole life to this. And whatever the record books said about a certain summer night in 1982, no one in that building was thinking about lane oil. They were thinking about the length and beauty of a devotion. His personal life, like the private lives of most men of his generation, he kept largely to himself, and the historical record is quieter here than it is about his scores. Men born in 1930 were not raised to narrate their inner weather. They kept their griefs and their doubts behind the teeth, presented a steady face to the world, and did their weeping, if they wept at all, in private. So we do not have the full accounting of Glenn Allison's heart, the long stretches of loneliness that surely came with the fading of his fame, the quiet nights behind the liquor store counter when a younger man might have wondered what it had all been for. We can only infer them, the way you infer the shape of something from the shadow it throws. But the outlines of his life are clear enough, and they are warm. Marcia was the great companion of his later decades, his wife, at his side from 1995 onward, which means she came into his life well after the glory years and well after the heartbreak of the denied series, and stayed to the end. She was the woman who stood in the crowd at milestone after milestone, whose face appears again and again in the accounts of his tournament appearances, a steady, loving presence beside the aging champion. 30 years they had together, 3 decades of watching him march down that center aisle, of celebrating the records and absorbing the disappointments, of the ordinary, sustaining companionship that a long marriage becomes. When the sport denied him and denied him again, she was there. When the crowds rose to their feet for him, she was there.
There is a particular kind of loyalty in a woman who loves a man not for the height of his fame, but for who he is in the ordinary years afterward, and Marcia gave him that. And there was family beyond her, children and grandchildren who carried the Allison name and the Allison feel for the game. A son, Mark, a daughter, Suzanne, a grandson who bore his own name, Glenn Allison II, and a granddaughter, Danielle. In 2024, at the very last of his record-setting tournament appearances, something happened that seems almost written for the ending of a film. Because for the first time in all his 72 years of competing, he bowled the tournament on a team made up entirely of his own family. His son, his daughter, his grandson, his granddaughter, all of them beside him on the lanes. He stood before the crowd, 93 years old, and thanked his friends for coming to watch him break the record. And then he thanked his family, the four of them there with him, and said it plainly that this was a first, having all his teammates be his own blood. You can feel across the distance how much that meant to him. The applause and the trophies were one thing. This was another. This was the quiet fulfillment of a long life, the sense of a circle closing. There were harder passages too, because a life of 95 years does not run smooth to the end. On Christmas Eve of 2017, driving to a part-time job as a front desk clerk at the very bowling center where he had made history, La Habra Bowl, he was in a car accident bad enough to total his vehicle and to fracture his sternum and 2 vertebrae. Think of the image of it.
An 87-year-old Hall of Famer, one of the founding fathers of professional bowling, working a front desk job on Christmas Eve to keep himself busy and afloat, broken and battered on a holiday night. There was never great wealth cushioning Glenn Allison's later years. He worked. He kept working long past the age when most men have retired to their recliners, not out of desperation alone, but because the bowling alley was where he belonged, where he had always belonged. From the boy of 16 to the old man behind the counter, he healed from the crash, as he seemed to heal from everything, and he came back to the lanes. What was it, in the end, that let him carry so much and stay whole? Some men are made bitter by a single injustice.
Allison absorbed a lifetime of them. The denied 900, the denied age record, the bowling alley lost, the ordinary money worries, the working years that stretched into his 90s, the physical wreckage of the accident, and through all of it, he remained, by every account, generous and good-humored and grateful. Perhaps it was the game itself that saved him. Bowling is a sport of humility when you come down to it, a sport in which even the greatest players miss, in which perfection is measured in the impossible and every frame offers a fresh chance to fail. A man who spends 70 years rolling a ball at 10 pins learns something about acceptance, about the way triumph and disaster arrive on the same lane and must both be met with the same steady hand. You cannot control the pin that wobbles and stands. You cannot control the committee that inspects your lanes the morning after your finest hour. You can only control your own release, your own approach, your own willingness to walk up to the line one more time and throw the ball as true as you know how. Allison seemed to understand this in his bones. He kept walking up to the line. For 72 years, he kept walking up to the line, long after the fame had faded, long after the injustice had been done and redone. And there is a philosophy in that persistence more eloquent than anything he could have said. Or perhaps it was simply the people, the teammates and the friends, the fans who never stopped calling him Mr. 900, the family that gathered around him in his final years. A man is not held up by his records. He is held up by the people who love him. And Allison, whatever the official books denied him, was rich in that currency. When he stood at 93 before a crowd and thanked his son and his daughter and his grandchildren for standing on the lanes beside him, you understood that he had found, in the long, quiet years after the noise, the thing that actually lasts. He described his career as a wonderful honor, said he had enjoyed every minute of it, called becoming a Hall of Famer something he had dreamed of since he was a teenager, and there is no reason to doubt a word of it. He got into both Halls of Fame that mattered, the USBC in 1979 and the PBA in 1984, honors that formally denied him his 900 and yet enshrined the man who rolled it, a contradiction he seems to have accepted with a shrug and a smile. He was ranked among the greatest bowlers of the 20th century. He had, whatever the paperwork said, done the impossible on a July night, and hundreds of people had watched him do it, and their memory did not require an official stamp.
When you look at the whole span of it, from the Citrus Town boyhood to the Falstaff glory days to the liquor store counter to that shining stolen night in La Habra to the final family team decades later, what you see is not the story of a robbery, though a robbery is in it. What you see is the story of a man who loved one thing his entire life and gave himself to it completely, who was rewarded and cheated in almost equal measure, and who decided that the loving mattered more than the record-keeping. The sport tried, in its bureaucratic way, to erase his greatest moment. It could not erase him. Everyone in bowling called him Mr. 900 to the end, and the name was an act of defiance and love, the community's refusal to accept the official verdict, their insistence that they knew what they had seen. He died on the 7th of October 2025 at the age of 95 in Corona, California, not far from where he had begun. He had finished his tournament career third on the all-time pinfall list, more than 123,000 pins across 72 years, just a few hundred short of second place, close enough to sting, which was somehow fitting for a man who spent his life a hair's breadth from the recognition he deserved. He had been given, at that final convention, a gold and diamond ring with the number 72 on it for the appearances no one will ever match. And he left behind Marcia and Mark and Suzanne and the grandchildren and an entire sport full of people who understood that the most famous number in bowling belonged to a man the official books would not let claim it. Somewhere in California, there is still a scorecard that says 900. The committees said it did not count. The federal court agreed. And yet, ask any bowler in America who rolled the first perfect series. Ask the men who were in that room at La Habra on a summer Thursday in 1982. Ask the fans who stood and cheered him down the center aisle when he was 80 and 90 and 93, and you will get the same answer without hesitation every single time. His name was Glenn Allison. He was Mr. 900, and he was one of ours.